You've come to the right session. I'm very happy to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about the insights from commercial application of the carbon removal budget approach. And I'm going to be joined by Inji, who you all know, obviously. It's going to talk about the implications of CDR budgeting for different types of player in the CDR value chain. And then we'll hand over to Juan, who's from Imperial, or UCL. Doing a PhD looking at modeling optimized CDR portfolios and looking at the trade-offs between the various types of constraints and sustainability issues for that. Each talk is going to be about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And I'm going to give a few opening remarks on where I see this issue of removal budgeting and kind of the reflecting on some of the experience that I've had over the last 5 years or so. So that work started with a project for NASDAQ, actually, in 2020, when we advised them on the opportunities in this voluntary carbon market space. And that led to their investment in Puro Earth, which I think has been a good success, good case study for us. We also do price projections for CDR credits. So we model the supply and demand for carbon removal, and typically we sell those to developers. And I've been working for the last 3 or 4 years with Microsoft on their procurement of carbon removal and helping to try and de-risk some of the issues with those projects. And I'm going to divide the reflections up into 3 parts. So it's going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly. On the good side, I think corporates are waking up to the opportunity that CDR presents. And if we look at the relative balance between the voluntary carbon market, the conventional offset market, and the permanent removal market, the permanent removal market has scaled dramatically faster than the voluntary carbon market or conventional offset market, to a point where the conventional offset market is now worth about $500 million a year, compared to about $6 billion for the permanent CDR market. So permanent CDRs have really taken off. And together with that, partly because of the tech companies putting the money in and so on, there is this sort of spirit of innovation in this space, kind of feeling that you need to put money in and develop the technology, and that's going to result in the cost reduction, a la the renewable energy playbook. And utilities and other institutions that have got money to spend but have so far sat on the fence on CDR are starting to come into this to this arena. So maybe slightly more risk-averse companies are seeing the opportunity. So that's also positive. We're also seeing some improvements in the digital MRV space as well. So initiatives that are undertaken by likes of Puro and Isometric and so on, organizations like Mangrove Systems and to some extent B0 and stuff, they're bringing more transparency to the market here, and that's a really good thing. And the end goal is to have a commodified market, so anyone can invest anywhere, anytime, blah, blah, blah. The final good piece of news is on the demand side, right? We've already heard with that comparison between carbon budgets and carbon removal budgets, and the concept of net zero and the corporate responsibility for net zero is very well established. So it goes on to say, well, the net in that net zero strategy should also be equally understood. And that hasn't got the attention it deserves yet, but now we've got a mechanism to address that. So that's all the good. The bad, the obvious one is there's not very much demand out there in the market. And that's the real elephant in the room. And if it weren't for Microsoft, there really wouldn't be much of a market for permanent CDR, that's for sure. And the challenge is that we tend to be drawn into the discussion about the Science-Based Targets Initiative aligned organizations, and particularly the tech companies therein, and so on. And we forget about all the other large volume of emissions that go unnoticed, basically, and unpriced. In our analysis, we expect only 2.5% or less than 2.5% of global emissions to be, or companies that account for 2.5% of emissions to actually buy any of these credits. So that kind of shows you how spiked the demand curve is for this market. And that means to solve that kind of problem, to bring those companies in that don't get in the limelight, that requires policy, and hopefully we can talk about that, about integration into compliance markets like the ETS and so on, and we'll get into that. But as a sort of straw poll, what % of Science-Based Targets Initiative companies do you think have purchased permanent CDR to date? So put your hand up if you think it's less than 50%. Less than 10%. Or keep it raised. Less than 10%. Less than 5%. Less than 1%. Yeah, less than 1%. So those that have still got their hand raised are the right answers there. But it just shows, we're going niche, and really we need to broaden that demand base a lot. The other issue is that we're a bit obsessed by this mitigation deterrence problem. And I would argue that the only real problem here is about mixing nature-based removals in with permanent removals. And if we really drew that distinction and separated them, then that problem of mitigation deterrence could really fall away, because the price points of these things are radically different. If we've got the ETS trading at, but well below $100 a ton, but the cheapest permanent removal is well over $100 a ton, then I don't see much risk of mitigation deterrence there. And finally, I'm going to end with the ugly, and that can be summarized in a single word, which is obfuscation. And if we're to make any progress in this promoting the carbon removal budgeting approach, we need clarity on a few issues, and I've centered around 3 issues that I've identified. So the first one is the fungibility of non-permanent removals with permanent removals, which Han is going to talk about, I hope. And we need clarity on whether those nature-based removals can indeed be used to neutralize fossil emissions or not, if they were sufficiently uprated. The second is around pricing and having a kind of climate literate pricing policies. So at the moment, there's no pressure for corporates to disclose the price that they're trading these carbon credits at. And if this whole carbon removal space is going to become a waste management issue, and we need to know the price of that waste management issue. And what's happening is there's a gulf between internal carbon prices that are lofted around, which may only apply for 5% of the business's activities and might be really aspirational in the potentially 3-digit figure. Meanwhile, are happily buying carbon credits at the sort of $10, $30 a ton, which is not a climate literate strategy to get to your net zero. Everyone knows that. And the third issue is an issue that Alice raised actually in the first session, which is where does CCS fit in all this as well? So a lot of the removal technologies, DACs and BECS, share a lot of the characteristics of that CCS infrastructure, but the balance between that CCS infrastructure and the CDR is not defined at all. And there's a danger, as I see it, that actually CCS could be the one that's left out in the cold, and actually all the attention gets on the Microsoft and the CDR deals, and less gets into the fossil fuel and CCS domain. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ingi, and interested to hear what you're going to say.
Cool. Thank you, Mostyn. Just checking, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Wonderful. So, yeah, I'm going to speak a little bit about commercial applications of carbon removal budgeting. And just to say, we were meant to have Dr. Arjeta Shpuza coming in from the University of Albania, who unfortunately had to pull out, but she was going to present on the CRB's application within the Albanian banking context. So that would have been a really interesting application of it. But also, if you're interested in that, I'm happy to connect, and she could share her paper with you. Before I jump into this, we've talked a lot about the kind of macro corporate demand and, the Microsofts and whatnot of the world, but I wanted to give an example of a very recent one of a product, actually, that has kind of gone on a little bit of this journey. So not kind of full carbon removal budgeting approach, but really to look at, emissions embedded within it and to offset those with permanent CDR. And it comes from a very surprising source, which is a football club here in the UK who has got on this journey for one of their new football shirts. Does anyone know it in the room? Any guesses? Yes, yeah, correct. Wow, the pop quiz succeeds. But I think it's a really interesting kind of use case because we can get kind of fixated, I guess, on the Microsofts and whatnot of the world. But I think it's really interesting to see how corporates and indeed, other institutions, and I would say here in England that football is an institution that have started to really take this seriously and to explore this journey. So with that, I wanted to really highlight that there are a range of potential commercial applications of carbon removal budgeting. And as I said at the start, this is both on the supply side, but also the demand side. And in my presentation today, I'll be touching on both aspects. So I'll be speaking principally and first about kind of developers of carbon removal, then move to intermediaries who facilitate access to that same carbon removal. We'll then consider corporates and financial institutions who require carbon removal to reach their net zero targets or otherwise decarbonize their investment portfolios, including to help reach their science-based targets. And as well, consider the ancillary services. So we've heard from some today, like B0, but really there's a broader range of opportunity for entities to start modeling carbon removal budgets and really assisting on the kind of implementation of them. So starting with the supply side, goes without saying that developers of carbon removal, nearly without exception, have been from the private sector. So one of the immediate kind of commercial applications of it lies within this component of the supply chain. And so really critically, developers, particularly of the durable CDR kind, are often faced with lengthy processes to kind of illustrate demand in the long term, to secure their FID decisions and whatnot. And I think as part of this, carbon removal budgeting can help provide some clarity because it can help forecast that demand based on residual emissions, based on emissions profiles. You can keep it up to date annually. You can, examine how it looks under different temperature alignments and portfolios. And critically, it can be a useful tool, particularly for those that are interested in, across a number of different pathways, but to help calibrate the kind of costs involved, as well, because we know that that is part of the supply side of carbon removal budgeting. It can also help draw attention on the importance of raising R&D components and that role in improving technological readiness levels. As I mentioned, one of the biggest challenges is securing sufficient offtakes and kind of forward guarantees of financing. And this can again help that ultimately to help secure FIDs and commence building plants and operations, because when we're talking about, again, particularly the engineered removals, we are talking about large-scale engineering projects, and we need to be realistic that this requires a lot of forecasting, and carbon removal budgeting can be one of those tools that can enable that. Then intermediaries. So intermediaries play a really critical role, particularly the voluntary carbon market right now, acting as brokers not only of supply but also guidance. So as we've unpacked this morning, it is a bit of an alphabet soup out there of complexity, and particularly for corporates and FIs that have particular use cases. Intermediaries play a really useful function here in order to help smooth out that transaction between the supply and demand. So intermediaries could also use carbon removal budgeting, particularly to inform the kind of portfolios that they're creating. And we know portfolio approaches are becoming more and more popular. We speak to them in the oxide offsetting principles, but carbon removal budgeting can help draw attention to where potential dependencies or risks in the supply chain of different pathways can come from, and critically also enable a broader map of the carbon removal landscape. Again, both with that can assist intermediaries in securing their own supply, but also in advising their clients that they do. So then we're shifting from the demand side to shifting from the supply side to the demand side. And when we consider the particular role of corporates and financial institutions, Jacobo mentioned in his presentation this morning that this was one of the areas where further thoughts were needed in terms of what could this practically look like. And especially we get questions around, what does downscaling a global temperature goal look like for a corporate? I mean, the first place we can look to for that is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, right? And that kind of 1.5 aligned pathway that they offer. But really, it's worth saying that carbon removal budgeting can be used in tandem with other tools, including internal carbon pricing. And we're about to release some principles on net zero aligned internal carbon pricing that are forthcoming. But they can really be used to identify, again, dependencies in the supply chain. And this is critical because once you look at how big a carbon removal budget deficit you may be facing, that can act as a critical window to then facilitate conversations with CFOs and CEOs to start securing your offtakes, to start having real conversations, not only about securing your access to carbon removal, acknowledging that this could actually be both internal in a form of insetting, but also external through offsetting portfolios. But critically, and as we've heard throughout the day, there's a real importance on ensuring we uphold the mitigation hierarchy and making every effort to internally decarbonize first. And again, when we look at the carbon removal budget equation, we can see that by reducing our demand for carbon removal, we ultimately can reduce the supply that we then need to match that. And that can be one of the easiest levers, particularly when we're facing a kind of high cost of some durable CDR pathways. We can then also consider the role of ancillary services. So we see ancillary services as being able to support, as I mentioned, the quantification of carbon removal budgets. So just the same as different services exist to help with your financial forecasting and whatnot, or even just kind of general consulting, we see carbon removal budgeting as being an area where corporates, FIs, governments can be assisted in order to help map their respective carbon removal budgets. But as we also unpacked this morning, the quality of carbon removal also matters greatly. And so this is where ancillary services like B0, like Silvera, like others, play a really important role in the discovery of integrity, and again, hopefully ushering in a flight to that. And again, a powerful thing about the carbon removal budget is that when you're looking at available supply, you can define available supply as meeting a certain quality threshold. So while the broad kind of carbon removal budget equation sits at this level, you can then apply further constraints that particularly suit your context. And quality could be one of them, particularly if reputational risk or something else like that is of top of mind. But it's also critical for atmospheric integrity, and this is why we'll get into the conversation concerning durable CDR versus some more non-durable kinds, and the importance, to Mostyn's point, about ensuring fungibility or questioning whether fungibility is indeed even possible. And then ancillary services, again, can really unpack some of the implications of carbon removal budgeting for transition planning. And again, this is not just to help the forward-thinking corporates undertake their transition plans, but equally recognizing that we're entering an age of compliance, and these all being critical dimensions which require all the tools that we have in our toolkit. So I wanted to just provide a very practical example of this. So what does this look like in practice? So I dreamed up an FMCG company with an internal carbon price, $100 across all scopes. In theory, carbon prices can be flat, but they could also be escalating over time. And in this theory, or this case study, we did that. And so if you've got a variable price, you then estimate your carbon removal supply. And again, obviously, as your price goes up, so does the kind of access and the supply potentials that you unlock. Here again, you can forecast the low, medium, and high potentials, and this could be dependent on your offtake agreement secured, or even the deployment rates and actually delivery rates of some technologies, because as has been mentioned, oftentimes we're having to make pre-purchases and deliveries are a different dimension, and so it's really important here that we're accurately forecasting the range of potential supplies in order to inform an accurate carbon removal budget estimate. Then we can see that they could use the 1.5 alignment goal. That gives them an envelope for their internal decarbonisation efforts, but they can also then accordingly downscale their removal targets. They could do this, for instance, also in tandem with the interim removal targets that could be set via SBTI and whatnot. But really, by putting together these two components would yield insight to the annual carbon removal budget surplus, deficit, or whether in fact they have managed to balance their books. And then again, you could look at this annually, but then you could cumulatively look like, what does this mean for 2030? So this is just an example of how a corporate could go about it in practice. Again, we see the role of ancillary services stepping in to help bridge this gap in kind of applying such a kind of concept into the real world, and again, given the range of constraints that exist in various corporate scenarios. Just to close off with some further considerations, so we really see that there is potential here through carbon removal budgeting to unlock some real comparative advantages. You can do that across geographies, across pathways, but really the use and development of them create an opportunity for corporates and other financial institutions to really get ahead of the curve, especially in terms of identifying prospective investments. We also see that they add analytical value. So there is a variety of applications, both internal on the supply side as well as relating to the demand side. And we're able to calibrate through a carbon removal budget, again, not just an application to an entity as a whole, but even micro applications. So for instance, that Liverpool FC t-shirt is an interesting case study of that. And finally, carbon removal budgets can be used for more accurate forecasting. So again, investments in this space and climate policy in general can face several headwinds. We're experiencing many of them right now. But carbon removal budgeting acts as a bit of an anchor back to the science of what we know we need to achieve to reach that balance of sinks and sources to get to net zero, but even beyond that, to ultimately stabilize concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and thereby limit warming. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I look forward to any questions further on, but I'll pass the floor over to Juan. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Huan Shen, and I'm a PhD student from Imperial College London, Center for Environmental Policy. And today, I'm very honored to introduce our research about scaling sustainable carbon removal, extending the Monet framework for optimized CDR portfolio. This is research I've done, worked with my supervisor, Niall McDowell. And to begin, let's recall the scale of the climate challenge, which mentioned in the IPCC sixth assessment report. That, as we can see in the image, that we need to remove between 100 and 1,000 billion tons of CO2 by 2100 to keep a long-term warming below 1.5 Celsius degree, and that's not optional; it's essential. Even in deep mitigation scenarios, it is essential. This translates into a need to remove 5 to 10 gigatons of CO2 every year by mid-century. Even with deep decarbonization, sectors such as aviation, agriculture, and heavy industry will continue to produce residual emissions. To achieve this net zero target, these residuals must be balanced and by durable and verifiable carbon removals. Moreover, to revise temperature overshoot and move towards negative emissions later this century, large-scale deployment of carbon dioxide removal is indispensable. Emission reduction alone will not suffice. CDR must scale up rapidly. So, why CDR portfolio matters? We know we need to scale up CDR rapidly, but not just scale up. How we do with the CDR matters. Each CDR pathways, whether it's afforestation, it's bags, it has its own limitations. The concern of capacity, the different influence of each CDR pathways, each solutions make it rely on just one pathway is neither realistic nor relevant. For example, forests are low cost, and provide a lot of core benefits like biodiversity, but they are also impermanent and land intensive. And technologies like DAX, they give us very high quality carbon removal, very permanent carbon removal, but they are with a very high cost, and they are with a very high energy consuming. So that's why we need a portfolio approach, a strategic mix of CDR methods. This allows us to scale quickly with near-term options while investing in long-term, high-permanence solutions. It is also spread risks, maximize regional fit, and keeps total system costs lower over time. So, about our research. Our research is mainly about these 4 questions. How can we compare different CDR pathways? What will compose the portfolio of CDR pathways? How will this change around the world? And how can we integrate carbon quality into the market and portfolio? So before we making any deployment decisions, it's important to recognize that a good CDR pathways involves more than just a number of tons removed. So how can we compare different CDR pathways? We to quantify and optimize from financial feasibility, technology performance, and environmental constraints. We introduce 3 key metrics in the middle to characterize and compare each CDR pathways. And just like Inje said before this morning, how to measure the quality of CDR influences the growing of CRB, which do matter. And in the like in the Oxford offsetting principles, which emphasize the matrix of permanence, the permanence, verifiability, and additionality matters too. This is another matrix we want to put into our calculation. Then the question comes to what will compose the portfolio, or a portfolio, what it looks like. So this is where the MONET framework comes in. MONET is a system-level optimization framework, and that helps identify cost-optimal CDR portfolios under various constraints. The MONET framework composed by 2 parts. At below, you can see there's value chain parts, which is the modeling parts, and after that, there's a optimization part, which give us the optimization result of portfolio. So in the MONET model, we represent the full value chain of each CDR pathways from deployment from the beginning to the end under financial and national resource costs, qualified core benefits, and other concerns. And in the optimization part, we're using the matrix calculated from the model, considering the specific biogeophysical constraints of the given scenario, makes the optimized portfolio with the objective of removal cost. So on the top, this is a sample of the MONET framework structure, which describes the bags. And on the right, this is a sample of the MONET output. So this is specific, the EU portfolio optimized by the MONET with a target of IPCC P3. So now we have the framework we can use to give a try to describe what the portfolio looks like. So next, the question comes to what does an optimized global landscape looks like? So by this is the MONET result, optimization result of the global different region of global. And you can see here, the EU, India, and the USA. The top one is IPCC P3 CDR targets as a target. And the bottom one is with a higher target, IPCC P4 CDR targets, which is used to describe the extreme scenario of the CDR portfolio. And you can see for EU, India, and USA face early exhaustion of land and biomass resources, turn to DEX to meet higher CDR targets. And for China, we have abundant land and biomass, enabling large-scale BECCS deployment. And for Brazil, the deployments of biochar are sufficient to meet the 21 gigaton CO2 required by 2100. Another interesting point is about India. Even though India has a relatively low IPCC P4 target, the constraint of their natural resource, of their biomass supply, still constrain them to cannot meet the IPCC P4 targets. So this is what the world portfolio looks like by the optimization of MONATE. And after that, back to Inge just talk about CDR quality do matters. So when we talk CDR quality, we always divide the CDR into two kind, which is permanent CDR and non-permanent CDR. So with this kind of divide, or this kind of sort of, that comes with a question. That is, does impermanent CDR still provide meaningful climate value? Since there are already a lot of CDR projects which is not permanent in the world. So is it still worth investing in impermanent CDR more broadly? Can we propose to rethink permanence, trying to not think it as a binary attribute, but as a spectrum of climate fungibility? So our recent study shows that even non-permanent carbon removal can provide valuable climate benefits over defined time frames. As you can see, give an ideal experiment of this kind of scenario, we give 5 different dimensions. So at the first one, that is the background, which means we do not do anything after we release the carbon dioxide. And on the right, there are 4 different scenarios. At scenario A is immediate emission followed by permanent removal. Scenario B means immediate emission followed by removal that leaks after 500 years. You can see that from the beginning it's 0 and then 500. And scenario C, this is emission followed by permanent removal after 500 years. So there's emission and there's a supplement of the CDR. And for the scenario D, it's emission followed by removal that lasts 500 years before leaking. As shown, even in the case of full leakage, like scenario B, impermanent CDR can still reduce climate damage, especially in the near term. However, the magnitude of this benefit is highly sensitive to the time frame of observation, which means how you define the time of permanence. As a very extreme scenario for this problem is that if we take an observation time as 0, so there's no difference between impermanent and permanent. So which is why we introduced parameters into here, which is time of permanence, TP. You can see a TP column there. This is a TP. So to evaluate and compare the effectiveness of temporary and permanent removals over time. So if we pick a TP, we have a solid TP, then we can calculate the climate repair value, which quantifies the fraction of climate damage of a kind of climate CDR pathways, and based on how long the CO2 remains sequestered. And the cost of permanent removals, this is adjusted cost, taking consider of CRV, consider of the project costs, the fraction of carbon removal, and the MRV, and the revenue with the core benefits. So with this, we calculate this CPR with a solid time of permanence, we can work out this image, which is showing the CPR is varying with the time of permanence. As you can see in the picture, where permanence is defined in the range of 0 to 20 years, carbon sequestration from forests occurring over the first 25 years is out of the permanence range. So we can see a very sharp decline at that part. And thus resulting in high costs and proving the importance of requiring minimum longevity of these CDR solutions. But if we start at a permanence threshold of around 25 years, we can observe that the CPR for permanent CDR pathways begin to decrease, while the CPR for impermanent pathways, such as forestation, rise deeply as required permanence increase. Although afforestation appears cost-effective in the short term, it quickly becomes uncompetitive compared to BECCS beyond 300 years and DECCS beyond 750 years of permanence. This reflects the growing risk of reversal and the increasing MRV costs over time for impermanent storage solutions. So now we get the MRV, we get the permanent cost. How can we integrate all of these parameters of carbon quality into the portfolio? So this is about we put the CPR and the MRV into the MONET framework, and this is what works out. Take UK as an example. You can see that at the beginning, at the left top one, this is the UK usual portfolio from 2020 to 2100, and on the right, this is when we set the time of permanence as 50 years. You can see that the DECCS and the DECCS goes up sharply, and with the decrease of the BECCS and the decrease of the biochar. And at the bottom two, you can see the DECCS, the amount of DECCS and the BECCS is keep going up, which means in the long scope of the time of permanence, the non-permanent removal takes a lead in the end. So this is basically what I want to present today. This is about, I'm an engineering background student, so this is about I see this problem in an engineering way. Thank you.
Cool, thanks both. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some Q&A, where I get to quiz you both, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. I think the first question to Inji is, how transformational do you think this idea of carbon removal budgeting is in the context for corporates? We've already got the Science-Based Targets Initiative saying, okay, you need to ramp up durable CDR. Yeah, can you try and tease out what differences there might be with the new approach versus what's already existing?
Yeah, well, I think, and you raised this in the fireside chat panel, but one of the common criticisms of the SBTI framework is its kind of arbitrary nature. And I think we could even see that in some of the proposals about what the kind of interim removal targets could look like and whether those were, cumulative or single year and how those kind of would ramp up. And not only to get to that net zero state, but what happens beyond that. So I see carbon removal budgeting as being a tool to really, accurately forecast within a value chain that's kind of independent of, say, existing sectoral guidance or, or broader guidance, even in the case of SBTI. And so it enables that thinking, through one's own value chain. It includes, both internal decarbonization efforts or insetting opportunities if you're thinking about removal, as well as potential investments in offsetting. But I think the two frames aren't in conflict. I think you can kind of, especially if you're setting a kind of SBTI aligned pathway, then you've got a kind of temperature stabilization goal that you're looking for. And then, you can use their logic to kind of downscale that in terms of the carbon removal budget that you could develop.
So would you, if you could play God and get the Science Based Targets Initiative to do anything you wanted, what would you want them to do as a result of this?
Well, I mean, in some respects, and obviously we have to, I guess, remember it's a broad church, and I guess the nature, again, I think, one key theme from earlier session, and particularly what we'll dive into in the next plenary session too, is that we're on a pathway to compliance. So SBTI is still very much within the domain of voluntary, so there is, even if an omnipotent figure kind of were to emerge and dictate there is a risk, obviously, of alienation and whatnot. And so very conscious of the balancing act that has to be achieved there. But I think part of it would be encouraging, accurate forecasting of residual emissions right through. And then, some expectation to match that again to a kind of budgeting, via a budgeting approach to offset that. And that can be, relatively controversial. And we're seeing some moves from the compensation, space to contribution models where perhaps that ton for ton approach isn't as welcome. But I think it plays a critical role in at least also flagging, the likely deficit that many actors face, both governments as well as corporates and FIs, but to actively catalyze some urgency internally to actually help address that deficit.
Cool. And just staying with you here on trying to calculate those residual emissions, and if you used $100 a ton as your kind of realistic carbon removal price, but in the real world, would you want the Science Based Targets Initiative to kind of use that same sort of framework, or would you advocate a more sophisticated approach?
Yeah, well, I think, again, it, and linked to, I guess, what Silke said about, that we have these different frameworks to be able to approach how these things should be financed, and ability to pay is a really critical one, as is kind of marginal abatement cost curves. And so I think, and in general, I guess, taking a step back, what we see a lot of in corporate reporting is all the achievements of what entities are doing, but what we see very little of is all the things that they weren't able to decarbonize very specifically. And I think carbon removal budgeting helps put front and center what kinds of emissions are truly in that bucket of residual emissions, and helps to I guess bring those to light to then help rationalize decisions about where investment is going, whether it is internal decarbonisation or trying to secure offtakes and whatnot. But it also helps draw attention that this is a long-term game, that it is not something that meshes well often with kind of the annual reporting cycle of corporates, but carbon removal budgeting can be done annually, but it can also be aggregated cumulatively to help link back to those temperature stabilization goals or broader kind of carbon budget envelopes that SBTI and others, help to downscale to the corporate level.
Right.
Cool. I feel like this is an exam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, feels like it. Move on to Han.
Yeah.
So a lot of it was about this fungibility between the non-permanent CDR and the permanent CDR. Again, you talked about this spectrum, but what's happening is, say, the European Commission are saying multi-century cut-off, which for the private sector means 200 years. If you got to play God again in this policy space, what would you advocate for on that time frame?
So that's a very good question. So first off, when we talk about the permanence, we always talk about so I'm a God, right? So I can do anything I want. Mm-hmm. I can set the policy I want. So first of everything, I think the gap between the high quality CDR and the realistic isn't the technique. The gap between them is the money. So if I'm a God, I'm a policy maker. If I do care about all of this, you mentioned the high quality CDR things, I will give enough money to those who are working on these CDR projects, this kind of high quality CDR projects, give them enough supplement of this kind of money to work that out. Yeah.
So that points, if you have to pin it to a time frame, that points to the higher end of your spectrum, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
So not to put words in your mouth, but 1,000 years, are we saying?
So it's hard to say we have a specific time of the time point of the permanence, but I think based on, because we are human, our life is about 100 years, and we have generation after generation. So I think 3 or 4 generations is enough for a calculation, especially for some CDR projects. It's about this time period.
Interesting to bring the human element into it. Obviously, it is a human problem, but I guess it's grounded in science, right? And the atmosphere doesn't care about whether the humans are around or not. But anyway, we can shelve that for now. Who's your research aimed at? What do people do when they get this? Is it at the European Commission sort of level, or what do people do with the type of analysis that you've come up with?
I'm sorry?
Where is your research aimed at? Who do you want to facilitate? Like, who do you want to do something with the work that you've done?
So I am to build an balance between the impermanent and permanent CDR pathways to make the actually matrix of how much they can do, because we already have the climate influence of them, the matrix of climate influence of them. So next day, my aim is to build specifically the financial influence of different CDR pathways to give them balance. As I have said, I want to because the money is the drive of everything in the CDR pathways. So I want to give them enough supplement of this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, feeding off from that, then, Ingi, do you see any conflict between the Oxford offsetting principles and this onus on like-for-like accounting versus this approach where you kind of bundle these things up and trade them off against each other?
Yeah, and so this is a topic that we do discuss and have discussed as Oxford offsetting principle authors, is at what level are the principles even determined to be applied at. And the thing is, it's in theory, and there's been some papers that have come out to kind of say that to reach net zero, not everyone has to be doing removals, because in theory we can reach that scale at a global level, but the issue is a coordination piece. And so if we don't coordinate that at a micro level, at a corporate AFRY government level, then really everyone will, to the points that have been raised around price, go for the lower hanging fruit, and then we won't have that investment that we need to kind of tilt the scale. So I would say it's not in conflict, but I think it's also, I guess, about bridging the kind of scientific reality and that kind of, the pure physics of it compared to the real world practice that we know not everyone is purely downscaling that physics, that there are other constraints, financial access, even, geopolitical, and especially as we enter the era of Article 6 operationalization, but cross-border transactions and these kinds of things, of particularly durable CDR, which is much more tied to specific geographic locations and constraints. And, I think, it's, less of a scientific problem and more of a coordination problem. So that's why it matters to get the level right.
So if I was an ambitious corporate and I was aligned with Science-Based Targets Initiative, and say in 2030, it's legitimate to use a sizable portion of CDR from nature-based removals?
It depends on the type of corporate you are. I mean, again, I guess if you're purely following SBTI, everything's voluntary in the first instance, but also it matters for what purpose, right? And again, that's why I mentioned that we're seeing increasing sophistication between compensation and contribution models. In the Oxford offsetting principles, the revised version, we say it's not a trade-off. You don't have to choose. And in fact, I think it's, incorrect to force a choice between the two, because really, when we're thinking about compensation, that helps us put the foot on the gas in terms of internal decarbonization. It forces that kind of ton for ton accounting. Whereas really, when we extend it up to a global level, we are talking about a contribution to global net zero, and that does require coordination, but that also requires good corporates and those that can to really go above and beyond and better match their ability to pay as opposed to just their residual emissions. Mm.
And I guess if we're going back to Han, what's the size of the prize by having a portfolio approach? How much is the cost reduction? Is it really significant if we just had to do permanent CDR? How much of a discount can we expect through a portfolio approach?
So in my case of the optimization, most of portfolio is not just due for the cost you have mentioned. Most of the scenario is that we have a lot of constraints which make a simple CDR cannot make its way to the target. So at most of the scenario, we are not considering about the cost to do the optimization. We are considering how to touch the target. So at this scenario, we don't talk about the money. The money is the money. Since you want to do this, you need this kind of money. And as some kind of, you have mentioned like take Europe as an example. If we have enough natural resources, we have enough biomass supply, we have enough field to give those enhanced weathering experiment, we can do it as a cost discount, like you said. So based on my calculation, it's mostly about, not a big one, mostly about 25 to 30 beyond this percentage, but not too much. If you don't hit the extreme scenario, like you take all the things to the DEX, okay, the cost rise very sharply, but as other things like the natural base CDR, it's okay. It's not very a lot.
Cool, thanks. And you started global and then you went towards country-specific projections. How do you deal with the fact that removals are both a capture component, or sometimes two capture components that could happen independently in different countries, and then you've got a storage component? So in theory, the same removal could happen in 3 different countries. How do you tally that in your modeling?
I'm sorry, the applause just.
How do you deal with that in your modeling? Do you define a removal based on where the carbon is stored, where it's captured?
Yes, that's a very good question. In the Monet framework, the different region are modeled. So firstly, by the distance of the place they are. So for supply chain, we can calculate the energy and the carbon balance between them, and then the different natural base constraints are calculated by those country. Like in this area, we have this constraint, like we don't have enough biomass in that country. We have very little of the rock we can use for enhanced weathering. But all of this scenario, we do it. We have done it. We have calculated it. So it's like a big map. You pick one place you want to do it, and you can do it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. And sort of flipping your work on its head and saying you focused obviously all on the supply side, would you consider trying to extend this to the demand side? So working out which sectors buy which?
So until now, I don't have that plan to extend it to demand side. Since when we consider about demand side, it's more about the market activity. It's not just like engineering based thing. But so about demand side, I do have a try of that when I want to integrate the ETS, the different carbon price into the revenue of the optimization. Since it will come very soon, right? The C-band will comes very soon into the revenue of the calculation. But it turns up, since we don't have actually a forward communicating carbon market, like the carbon price in different countries are different. The calculation end up with maze. Like you do this kind of CDR, you don't need to put anything in it. You can even earn a lot from it, like do afforestation, since the cost is not so high. So this is maybe it happened in our real life, but it is not work out in the calculation.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to see it at some point in time, but I agree. It's pretty complicated. And I mean, neither of you touched on. It's not quite the elephant in the room because not really people are talking about it, but the demand killer for CDR is geoengineering. And what happens? How does the carbon removal budget approach have to be adapted to accommodate, say, some potential from geoengineering?
Has anyone here read The Ministry for the Future? You can put your hand up. Okay, Jordan. Excellent. Well, it's super. Ministry for the Future. Yeah. Because what's super interesting, and apologies, this will result in some spoilers, but it actually, I mean, it opens with some scene setting from a COP and kind of negotiations, but it quickly results in a severe heat wave and a country taking geoengineering-based action to counteract that. That obviously then sparks a whole lot of geopolitical implications and whatnot. But what's really interesting about the book is that ultimately it leads to and develops a solution over time. And then the solution does actually look a little bit like carbon removal budgeting and carbon credits, because it results in carbon farming and it results in this very decentralized kind of means of bottom-up scaling of carbon and benefits going back to local communities and whatnot. And it's a really good read because it's almost like kind of dreaming up the carbon market without with forgetting that we've actually already tried to do this for a few decades and have run into some issues. We've got some improvements to make for sure, but I'd really recommend that book for contrasting the two approaches. But I think and as we've discussed, like this really interesting thing about so if you have a persistent CRB deficit, again, what does that look like and mean? And I think why it is so important to pay attention to this net and net zero is to enable us to have the full range of tools and options available, to avoid unilateral geoengineering approaches being applied. But I think increasingly we are at risk of that, which is why I think these kind of proactive forecasts and tools can be really powerful in trying to help avoid that and help look at all our options. Instead.
Cool. Thanks. Okay, right, we're going to open up to the floor. Who's got some burning questions? Yeah. Got a few minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Prina. I'm a corporate lawyer at Linklaters. Thank you very much for your presentations. They were very helpful. My question is to you, Mostyn. From a corporate demand perspective, why do you think there is such a huge discrepancy in what Microsoft is doing versus its counterparts? What, in your opinion or to your knowledge, is incentivizing them versus not incentivizing the others? What do they know?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't put my finger on it. And I think Silke was sort of getting to it on her second point. She was saying that corporates engaged in the space are often trying to sell products off the back of it and so on. So I'm not speculating that Microsoft is proposing to do that, but there might be some vested interest down the line. That's the only thing that I can really think of other than just pure climate leadership, which is a bit of a weak argument. But it's got to come from somewhere, and I'm very glad that they've taken the lead on it. But it's I mean, the stats that Silke showed didn't even do it justice. So to date, Microsoft is responsible for 90% of the permanent CDR offtake this year. So yeah, the concentration is growing, not diversifying. But yeah, keen to hear what anyone else thinks on that. It's very hard to determine. Yeah.
Coming back to that particular point, earlier this year, JP Morgan arranged a loan for a forest development company in the US to grow a lot of, create forests over the next few years with Microsoft buying all the carbon credit offtakes for that. And I was speaking to the JP Morgan team earlier this week, and they're seeing more opportunities for that. But I think it could also be, that structure could also be for engineered projects as well. That if you can get an organization to buy the offtakes of the carbon credits, then you've got the financing for the engineered projects. But my question was more around SBTI. My understanding is that is to drive mitigation of carbon emissions for corporates. But there was a real controversy about them, was it earlier this year, was it last year, around allowing companies to use carbon credits for their zero emission targets. And what's your view on that as a panel?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. And I think part of the controversy, when we think about mitigation, there is both reductions and removals practically. But I think, you're very right that SBTI, particularly in terms of the demographic of companies that it has been able to attract, focuses in on internal decarbonization first. But then again, it still had that the 5% slice at the other end, and attention is increasingly paid to what does that look like, and feasibly and practically, it's not efficient nor economical for every entity to kind of undertake that internally. So I think in some respects, the neutralization component, always was going to be external, but I think where the controversy is in relation to the mitigation, like the emissions part of the mitigation pathway. We see that across the board, so not just in SBTI, but in other frameworks, and indeed increasingly it's not just a corporate problem, but through Article 6 it's also a country-based problem, because if you take the foot off the gas in terms of your NDC achievement, which is principally emission reductions, and you seek to kind of offshore them using a form of credits in terms of mitigation outcomes, again, it can result in some perverse outcomes. I think hopefully in this end of the September we'll get some more clarity on what that could look like on the corporate sphere. But I think, again, we've got to bear in mind and not spend even too much time and oxygen in this kind of voluntary space, and really think through, again, what is lessons from this decade, or what have they been, and how can they translate to the compliance future that we're entering. Yeah.
Right. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, we're pretty much bang on time. We're going to a break now, and then we reconvene after that. So thanks very much to the panelists.
Yeah, great.